We're running a current account deficit of around about 5%, where we've got on the budget an argument that we've got a deficit before borrowing of roughly about 3.8, 3.9%. I'll come back to that. And we've got an economy that if anybody thinks it's going to grow at 2%, I'm more than prepared to take them out for lunch, for a free lunch. I don't think it'll go anywhere near 2%, right? If we're lucky, we'll get 1.5%. And then, looming large over the entire debate today was Eskom. It is quite extraordinary the extent to which the question of electricity now dominates everything, including tax policy. Because what was coming out today was, well, given the unreliability of electricity and given the increasing costs of electricity, how would you want to put another tax on top of that? Because it's going to really outprice us out of everything and therefore create massively deleterious consequences. The question that you ask people is, well, assuming we had a reliable electricity system, so of course they all burst out laughing because nobody ever thinks that's possible, but assuming it was, what then? And then the argument is, well, a carbon tax may be quite a good idea because it changes behavior patterns, but not in this circumstance. So frankly, I don't think you would be here and I wouldn't be here if we were growing at 5%. Because quite frankly, then there wouldn't be a tax problem. But here's the tax problem. The minister, it was suggested, let me take you back, it was suggested that this year's budget was dictated to a considerable extent by the rating agencies. Now, I'm not privy, notwithstanding what the press may say, to what the minister may be thinking. But what I am saying is obviously it's a considerable factor when you consider that we collect plus minus R1 trillion, and roughly 130 billion of that is going to interest. So if you work it out, if we get downgraded and our interest costs then go up, in a sense, let's say from 130 to 200 billion, just to take a postulate, well, it's perfectly obvious just the constraints that the country would then be operating. And I'll come back to that, if I may, in a moment. But so what we were faced with was, at this budget, was how were we going to show that the deficit was going to be going north, if I could put it colloquially, rather than south? How were we going to show that South Africa takes seriously its finances and the problem of an escalating debt? And there were two possible solutions to that. One clearly was the question of restricting government expenditure by roughly 15 billion, and the other was in a question of collecting taxes on an increased basis by a similar margin. That was the thrust of the budget. And why was it there? Because if the budget, if those figures were produced as they were, it would stave off the rainy day, give us some time, and hopefully ensure perhaps some uptick in the economy, which would therefore release the pressure on all of the questions that I've been alluding to. And it was quite good, I think, on one level. But may I just say this? I think the magic number is 6.8%, which was the budget, the increase for public service sector wages. Because if you take, and here's the point. If it goes above that, then the figures are out of kilter, save for one thing, that we collected 7 billion more in tax than we budgeted for. In other words, with all the newspaper reports, and it seems that the newspapers now seem to be delightfully keen on talking about SARS. But with all of that nonsense aside, SARS actually did collect 7 billion more than was even budgeted for on the budget. And I suppose there's a little extra leverage there, not much. But that's about it. So you may well talk about 7 or odd percent. But anything above that creates problems. Now, the reality, therefore, is we are faced with that set of constraints. In this year, we were somewhat fortunate by a fuel price that was lowering. And so we could pull out a sort of rabbit out of the hat and increase the fuel levy. Now, the one thing I didn't know, I mean, obviously Treasury knew, but I didn't know when I was an enthusiastic endorser of that fuel levy, was that the RAF, according to the budget review, then at that point, when the budget review written earlier this year, had a then existing liability of 98.5 billion. And the reason why the fuel levy went up more than just to deal with ordinary revenue was to try to deal with the 98.5 billion deficit in the RAF, to give you an explanation as to why that occurred. So the question was, how are we going to get the 15 billion that we sought to collect given the problems that we were facing? And the answer to that simply was, firstly, take the fuel levy. And then once you've got the fuel levy, well, what else can you do? And the fuel levy, as it were, was only going to get you sort of part of the way. The other part of the way was the question of, were we going to then increase VAT? Were we going to increase ordinary income taxes? How were we going to trigger anything above the 6,490 million rand, which was the increase in the general fuel levy? And of course, for smokers and drinkers, another 1.8 billion.